The high prairie stretched flat and endless under a sky bleached white by the merciless sun. Heat shimmered off the ground in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. The air tasted of alkali dust and something else, something acrid that made Keem's pony toss its head and snort uneasily. Kame reined in and sat motionless in the saddle, his body attuned to the rhythm of the land. He had been riding north for 3 days, carrying army dispatches and his own weariness. The scouting work paid in silver coins, but cost him in ways that had no name. White soldiers called him useful. His own people called him lost. He existed in the space between trusted by neither, needed by both. The wind shifted, carrying a stench that made his stomach tighten. Burned canvas, singed hair. The copper iron smell of blood left to bake under the sun. He touched his heels to the pony's flanks and rode toward the source. The wagon came into view slowly, like a bad dream taking shape. It lay on its side, one wheel splintered into jagged spokes, the canvas top torn and blackened. The strong box had been pried open and emptied, its contents scattered across the dirt, a woman's hairbrush, a tintype photograph face down in the dust, a child's wooden toy split in half. 3 bodies lay sprawled in unnatural positions. 2 adults and a young man, judging by their clothes. Bullet holes marked their backs. Flies had already claimed them, buzzing in thick black clouds that rose and resettled with every breath of wind. Kame dismounted slowly, every sense alert. Coyotes skulked at the edge of the wreck heads, low eyes reflecting yellow in the harsh light. They scattered as he approached, but did not go far. They had been waiting, and they were patient. On the far horizon, a dust plume rose in a slow arc. Riders circling back, coming to make sure nothing valuable had been left alive. Kame moved toward the wagon rifle, held easy across his chest, his moccasins silent on the hard-packed earth. He had seen ambushes before, both as scout and as target. This one had the deliberate shape of an execution. The victims had been shot while running, not fighting. There were no spent cartridges near their hands, no defensive wounds he could see from this distance. A sound stopped him mid-step, a thin, ragged breath, barely louder than the wind. He crouched and lifted the edge of a torn quilt near the wagon's undercarriage. A girl stared back at him with eyes too old for her face. She could not have been more than 8 years old, but those eyes had seen things no child should witness. Dirt streaked her cheeks in lines that marked where tears had carved through the grime. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, the fabric scorched at the hem. Soot blackened her arms up to the elbows. In those arms, pressed against her thin chest with a grip that made her knuckles bone white, were 2 swaddled newborns. The weight of them was too much for her small frame. Her legs shook with the effort of staying upright. If she tried to stand, if she stumbled, one of the babies would hit the ground. Kame spread his hands, slowly showing empty palms, then pointed to himself. "I will not hurt you," he said in careful English, keeping his voice low and steady. The girl's eyes flicked from the eagle feathers braided into his hair, to the Winchester rifle slung across his shoulder, to the bone-handled knife sheathed at his belt. Her breathing came fast and shallow, the kind that preceded either screaming or fainting. Her lips moved. At first, no sound came out. Then, in a voice scraped raw from smoke and terror, she asked the question that would change everything. "Would you keep one of them?" Keme went very still. "What?" The man said I had to pick. Her voice cracked. He said 1 lives, 2 die. I have to choose. Keme glanced at the dust plume on the horizon. It was closer now, close enough that he could make out individual riders, 4, maybe 5, walking their horses in a lazy circle. They would return within minutes to finish whatever they had started. He looked back at the girl and the 2 fragile bundles trembling in her arms. Her question hung in the air between them, like a curse, like a test he had not asked to take. Every instinct told him to ride away. This was white trouble, and white trouble had a way of following men who looked like him, ending in rope or lead. He had survived this long by knowing when to walk away. But the girl's eyes held him. In them, he saw his own sister dead, 20 years now from fever. He saw every child he had failed to save, every moment he had chosen survival over compassion. Instead of answering her question, he stepped forward. He scooped a scrap of torn canvas from the wreckage, wrapped both infants carefully into a single bundle that would stay secure against his chest, and lifted them from her shaking arms. "I do not choose who dies," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "We take all three. We move now." He swung her up onto the pony behind him, settled the bundled twins against his ribs, where his body heat would keep them warm, and spurred the animal toward a dry arroyo that cut across the prairie like a scar. Behind them, gunshots cracked the air. Bullets kicked up geysers of dust at the pony's hooves. A man's voice rose in a shout, words swallowed by distance, but the fury in them clear enough. Kame leaned low over the pony's neck, the girl clinging to his back, her face pressed against his shoulder blade. The twins made no sound. They were too young to understand that silence meant survival. He angled toward the arroyo's mouth and plunged into shadow. The rock walls rose on both sides, their surfaces striated in bands of rust and ochre, pocked with erosion from flash floods that came once a decade and scoured everything clean. The sound of pursuit echoed and multiplied until it seemed an army was chasing them. Kame rode hard, following the twists of the channel, his mind calculating distances and angles. The pony's breath came in harsh gasps. Foam flecked its neck. They could not keep this pace for long. The arroyo split into 3 smaller channels. He chose the narrowest, where the walls pressed so close that stones scraped the pony's flanks and left streaks of blood on the hide. The passage grew tighter. Finally, the horse could go no farther. Keme swung down in one fluid motion. He slapped the pony's rump hard, sending it bolting forward as a decoy, then grabbed the girl's wrist and dragged her toward a shallow overhang of rock. "Under," he hissed. "Do not move. Do not breathe loud." He shoved her into the narrow space, then crawled in beside her, the twins pressed between them. The overhang was barely large enough to hide them all. If a rider dismounted and looked closely, they would be found. Above them, hoofbeats thundered past. Shouts echoed off the canyon walls, distorted and layered. The loose pony's hoofbeats faded into the distance, and the riders followed, whooping and firing their guns. For a long moment, the only sound was the girl's ragged breathing and the faint mewling of the twins. Keme counted his own heartbeats. 100. 200. He listened for the scrape of a boot, the click of a hammer being drawn back, the telltale sound of someone waiting in ambush. Nothing. He crawled out slowly, every muscle tense, and scanned the arroyo. Empty. The riders had followed the pony deeper into the maze of channels, and with any luck, they would waste the rest of the afternoon searching. He motioned for the girl to follow. She emerged from the overhang, clutching the twins again, now that he had passed them back to her. Her legs shook so badly she could barely stand. He caught her elbow and steadied her. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though her face said otherwise. They moved on foot through the arroyo, following the dry riverbed that would one day feed Ghost Creek's wells. The sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and amber. Shadows pooled in the low places. Somewhere high above, a hawk screamed. That night they sheltered beside a thin trickle of water that seeped from a crack in the rock face. Kame built a fire so low and small that it barely cast light, Hidden behind a ring of boulders, he arranged with care. The smoke dispersed before it could rise above the canyon rim. He showed the girl how to hold one baby at a time against her chest for warmth, while he kept the other close under his poncho. The infant's tiny fist curled against his collarbone. The small body radiated a fragile heat that reminded him how easily life could be snuffed out. Between shivers, the girl began to talk. Her name was Lillian. Her family had been traveling to Sapphire Springs to claim land under the Homestead Act. Her father had been a printer in Ohio, but the war had taken his business and nearly taken his life. The West promised a fresh start, a chance to own something that could not be taxed or repossessed. At Ghost Creek Station, they had stopped to rest the horses and take on supplies. The station agent, a man named Bruno Keller, had approached them with a broad smile and an offer. Everyone called him Blue Moon, on account of the silver and turquoise ring he wore on his right hand, a piece of jewelry so distinctive it caught the eye. Bruno had looked at the twins born just 2 weeks earlier, still red-faced and squalling, and offered to arrange passage for them on the orphan train heading east. Just until you get settled. He had said, his voice smooth as oil. Plenty of good families back east looking to take in young ones. You can send for them once you have your homestead established. Save you the hardship of the trail. Lillian's mother had refused outright. They were keeping the twins. All of them would make it to Sapphire Springs together. Bruno had smiled and tipped his hat and said no more about it. 2 days later on the trail, masked riders had attacked the wagon. They had come at dawn when the light was still gray and uncertain. The hired hand had been watering the horses when the first shot took him in the back. He had fallen without a sound. Lillian's father had grabbed for his rifle, but a second shot spun him around and dropped him in the dirt. Her mother had thrown herself over the strongbox, begging them to take the money and leave. They shot her too. The leader had dismounted and walked slowly to where Lillian huddled with the twins. He had grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her out into the open. "Pick one," he had said, pointing at the babies. His voice had been almost kind, which made it worse. "1 lives, 2 die. You choose." Lillian's voice broke as she spoke. Kimi did not interrupt. He fed small sticks to the fire and listened. She remembered one detail with terrible clarity. When the man grabbed her arm, his glove had slipped back. On his right hand gleamed a silver and turquoise ring identical to the one Bruno Keller had worn at the station. During the chaos, a leather satchel had spilled from one of the riders' saddlebags. Papers tumbled out, caught by the wind. Lillian, acting on instinct she could not name, had lunged forward and snatched a blood-spotted scrap torn from a ledger. She stuffed it into the seam of her dress and ran into the scrub, while the men ransacked the wagon. Now she pulled the paper out with shaking fingers and handed it to Kimi. He turned it toward the firelight. The script was tight and angular, written in English he could not read fluently, but he understood numbers well enough. Columns of figures ran down the page. Beside them, scrawled in a hasty hand, were names, first names, only no surnames. Sarah, Thomas, Hannah, Lillian. At the top in larger letters was a heading, "Orphan Consignments, Ghost Creek Station." Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. "He was selling babies. Not just us. There are others." Keme folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his belt pouch. The evidence was fragile, but it was something. And somewhere behind them, men with that same ring and those same rifles were still riding. He fed another stick to the fire and watched the flames lick at the dry wood. The girl's eyelids drooped. She fought sleep as long as she could, but exhaustion claimed her before midnight. She slumped against the canyon wall with one twin cradled in her lap. Keme sat awake with the second infant tucked against his chest, listening to the coyotes sing their long, wavering songs in the darkness. He thought about the question Lillian had asked him. Would you keep one of them? What kind of man forced a child to choose which baby would die? What kind of world allowed such cruelty to exist unchallenged? He had no answers. But he knew one thing with certainty: he would not let those men take the children. Not while he still breathed. By dawn, they were moving again. The second day on the trail was harder than the first. Keme's pony, recovered during the night by backtracking carefully through the arroyo, was lame from a stone bruise. They moved slowly, conserving the animal's strength. Lillian walked beside the pony when the ground was level, carrying one twin while Keme carried the other. The landscape began to change as they moved west. The flat prairie gave way to broken country low hills dotted with juniper and piñon outcroppings of red stone that rose like broken teeth. Water was scarce. They rationed what little they had, giving most of it to the twins, who cried with hunger and thirst. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a rise and saw Ghost Creek in the distance. The town sat in a shallow valley where the dry riverbed met the foothills. It was small, perhaps 24 buildings clustered along a single main street. Smoke rose from chimneys. A church bell tolled the hour, the sound thin and reedy across the distance. And beside the town, belching steam and smoke, sat the orphan train. Keme studied the layout from their vantage point. The train station was at the east end of town, near a wooden bridge that spanned the creek. Beyond it, a scattering of tents and rough shacks marked a mining camp. Men moved between the buildings like ants, busy with purposes he could not discern from this distance. "We go in careful," he said to Lillian. "We find the law. We show them the paper. We tell them what happened." Lillian looked up at him with eyes that had learned not to trust adults. "What if the law does not believe us? Then we find another way." He led the pony down the slope toward town, moving openly now, because sneaking would only invite suspicion. Lillian walked beside him, the twins bundled against his chest, where he could shield them with his body. They reached the main street as the noon sun beat down. Conversations died as they passed. Shopkeepers stepped out of doorways to stare. Women pulled their children indoors, hands tight on small shoulders. Men lounged outside the saloon, hands drifting toward gun belts. Keme kept his gaze forward and his pace steady. He had walked through hostile towns before. The key was to show neither fear nor aggression, to move with purpose, but not haste. Sheriff Trusty Tom Alden stepped out of his office, thumbs hooked in his belt hand, resting near the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a face weathered by sun and wind, and a jaw that looked like it had stopped more than a few fists. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, polished to a high shine. "Hold up there," Tom called, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Where do you think you are going with those children?" Keme stopped, but did not step back. "To you. We need help." Tom's eyes narrowed. He took in Keme's Apache features, the feathers braided into his hair, to the rifle slung across his shoulder, the bone-handled knife at his belt. Then he looked at Lillian, white, dirty, terrified, and the two infants. "Step away from those young'uns," Tom said, his hand closing around the grip of his revolver. A woman in a gray dress hurried across the street from the schoolhouse, her skirts kicking up dust. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Behind her came a thin man, carrying a black leather doctor's bag. "Sheriff Alden," the woman said sharply, planting herself between Tom and Keem. If he meant them harm, they would not be breathing. Tom's jaw tightened. "Alice, this ain't your concern." "It became my concern the moment you drew your weapon on a man carrying infants." Alice Maud, the schoolteacher, turned to Kame. Her eyes were intelligent and assessing, but not unkind. "Are they hurt?" Hungry? Kame said. Thirsty? The girl is in shock. The doctor, a man named Theodore Finch, stepped forward and examined the twins without asking permission. He was perhaps 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful economical movements of someone who had set hundreds of broken bones and stitched thousands of wounds. He pressed his fingers gently to the infants' wrists, checked the color of their gums and the clarity of their eyes, and frowned. Dehydration, he said quietly. Possible exposure. They need fluids and warmth. We need to get them inside immediately. Not until I get some answers, Tom said, moving closer. Where did you find them? Prairie east of here. 2 days' ride. Wagon ambush. 3 dead. Tom's expression did not change. And you just happened to be passing by? Yes. Mighty convenient. Tom's voice carried an edge of skepticism that Kame had heard before, the assumption that an Apache near dead white settlers must be the cause, not the solution. Alice made an exasperated sound. For heaven's sake, Tom, look at the child. Does she look like she was taken by force? Lillian, still clutching the edge of Kame's poncho, shook her head violently. He saved us. The bad men were coming back to finish it. He hid us. Theodore scooped one of the twins from Kame's arms. We can argue about jurisdiction and procedure inside. These infants are in immediate danger. Every minute we stand here talking increases the risk of permanent harm. Tom stepped aside grudgingly, his hand still hovering near his weapon. But as the group moved toward the clinic, Kame caught something in Tom's eyes, a flicker of recognition, when Lillian mentioned bad men. A tightness around his mouth that spoke of knowledge, not ignorance. The clinic was a narrow, clapboard building that smelled of carbolic acid and old blood. Inside, Theodore worked with swift efficiency. He wrapped the twins in clean blankets, heated broth on a small iron stove, and used a dropper to feed them carefully, watching to make sure they swallowed. Alice knelt beside Lillian and spooned warm broth into her mouth, coaxing her to eat. Kame stood near the door rifle, still slung across his shoulder, watching the street through the window. His instincts prickled with a sense of being watched. He could see men gathering outside the saloon, their voices rising in speculation. Tom followed his gaze. You expecting more trouble? The sheriff asked, his tone carefully neutral. Trouble is already here. It followed us from the ambush site. Kame reached into his belt pouch and pulled out the folded ledger scrap. He handed it to Tom without explanation. The sheriff unfolded it and squinted at the tight script, turning the paper toward the light. His lips moved as he tried to decipher the words. But Kame noticed something. Tom's eyes stopped on certain words. Orphan consignments, Ghost Creek Station. And his face went carefully blank. Not confused, not surprised. Blank. After a long moment, he shrugged. Looks like freight numbers to me, maybe shipping manifests. The lie was smooth practiced. Kame felt cold certainty settle in his gut. Alice took the paper from Tom and read it carefully. Her face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks so quickly that Theodore glanced up in concern. Beneath columns labeled Received and Delivered were children's first names, Lillian Hannah Samuel Mary Emma, and sums of money written beside them in a neat, practiced hand. $20. $35, $50 for the youngest. At the top, in larger letters that seemed to mock the careful accounting below, was a heading, Orphan Consignments, Ghost Creek Station. Alice's hands shook. These are not freight numbers, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. These are children. Someone is selling children. Tom's face hardened. That is a serious accusation, Miss Maud. You had better be certain before you go spreading rumors like that. Before Alice could respond, the orphan train whistle blew outside 2 sharp blasts that echoed off the surrounding hills. The sound made Lillian flinch so violently that she nearly dropped her bowl of broth. Two men stepped off the train platform, moving with the confident swagger of men accustomed to violence. They carried saddlebags slung over their shoulders and a folded poster in one hand. The first man was tall and broad, with shoulders like an ox and hands scarred from years of rough work. His jaw was square and heavy, his eyes the color of stone. His name was Strong Steve Barlow, and he had a reputation across 3 territories for bringing in fugitives alive, if the bounty specified it dead, if it did not. The second man was shorter and wiry, with a face like a ferret, and eyes that never stopped moving, cataloging exits and weapons and weaknesses. Poison Pete Sharp, they called him, because he favored a knife with a blade he kept razor sharp, and knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum pain without killing quickly. They strode into the clinic without knocking their boots loud on the wooden floor. Strong Steve slapped a folded poster onto the examination table. "We are hunting a renegade Apache," he announced without preamble. "Took 3 white children from a wreck east of here. Railroad company wants its property back." Theodore straightened, still holding one of the twins. "Property? These are human beings, not livestock." "Figure of speech, Doc." Steve unfolded the poster and smoothed it flat. The woodcut illustration was crude, printed in black ink on cheap paper, but the features were recognizable enough. An Apache warrior with feathers in his hair, a rifle across his back, and a knife at his belt. The text below read, $200 reward. Wanted for abduction and theft. Approach with caution. Kemi felt the floor tilt beneath him. The poster had been printed before he ever reached town. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a trap set and sprung the moment he showed his face. Tom moved toward the bounty hunters with what looked like professional courtesy, but Kemi caught the subtle nod between them and the unspoken communication of men who had coordinated before. "That is him," Tom said, pointing at Kemi. "Came walking right down Main Street with the children, bold as brass." It was not an observation. It was confirmation. Tom had been waiting for them. Strong Steve's hand moved toward the Navy Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Step away from the children, all of you, now." Trusty Tom nodded, eager to demonstrate his authority. "You heard the man. Everybody back up." Theodore straightened, placing himself between the bounty hunters and the twins. "Now hold on just a moment. These children were brought here for medical care. I will not allow you to. We have been retained by the railroad." Poison Pete interrupted smoothly, his voice oily and confident. "Legal custody of any orphans traveling through Ghost Creek Station transfers to company representatives. That means us. We will see they are delivered safely to the orphan train for placement with proper Christian families." Alice's grip tightened on Lillian's shoulder. The girl flinched her eyes, darting between the bounty hunters and Kime with the trapped look of a cornered animal. "She has already told you what happened," Alice said, her voice shaking but determined. "They were attacked on the trail. Their parents were murdered. He saved them from the killers. And we are mighty grateful for that," Strong Steve said without a trace of gratitude in his voice. "But the railroad has procedures. These children are wards of the state until proper legal arrangements are made." Tom reached for Lillian's arm. "Come on, girl. Time to—" "No." Lillian jerked back, her voice rising to a near shriek. She clutched the edge of the examination table so hard her knuckles went white. "He will hurt them. The man with the ring. The same ring I saw it." Keme stepped between Tom and the girl in one fluid motion. "This is not your stock," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of controlled anger. "They are not calves to be herded." Poison Pete moved fast, his hand a blur, as he jammed the barrel of his revolver hard into Kami's ribs. "You do not give orders here, Apache. You are under arrest." Kami's hand snapped up, batting the gun aside with a force that surprised everyone in the room. The shot went off with a deafening crack that seemed to shake the very walls. The bullet shattered a glass jar of alcohol on a high shelf, sending burning liquid splashing across the floor. Flames spread instantly across the pile of clean bandages Theodore had laid out. Fire licked up the wooden wall. Theodore dove for a wool blanket, throwing it over the flames. Alice grabbed a basin of water from the washstand and hurled it at the fire. Her face twisted with fear and fury. Strong Steve swung his rifle like a club, aiming for Kami's head. Kami saw it coming and took the blow on his upper arm, the same arm already bruised purple from the chase through the arroyo. Pain exploded through his shoulder, but he used the momentum to drive his shoulder into Steve's chest, carrying them both through the clinic door in a tangle of limbs. They crashed into the street, sending bystanders scattering. Dust rose in a choking cloud. Men shouted, women screamed. Trusty Tom charged out behind them, his Colt drawn and his face set with grim purpose. As Kami and Steve grappled in the dirt, Tom raised his revolver and brought it down hard across the back of Kami's skull. The world went white, then gray. Kami's legs gave out. He dropped to one knee, vision swimming. Tom hit him again, and this time the darkness came all the way up. When the ringing in his ears subsided, Kami found himself on his back, in the dust-iron shackles locked around his wrists. The metal bit into his skin, already chafed raw from the day's hard riding. "You are under arrest," Tom said, breathing hard, "for assault on a peace officer resisting arrest and suspicion of abduction." Inside the clinic, as smoke curled toward the ceiling, and Theodore stamped out the last of the flames, let's watch through the window as Tom and the bounty hunters hauled Kami across the street toward the jail. His head hung low, blood trickling from his scalp where Tom had struck him. Theodore moved beside her, his face grave. "Alice," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Last night I was returning late from a call to the mining camp. I saw Tom and Bruno Keller meeting behind the saloon. They were counting money. A lot of it." Alice's stomach dropped. "Are you certain?" "I saw Bruno hand Tom a leather pouch. I heard him say, 'You're cut for this month. Keep doing what you are doing.'" Tom pocketed it without hesitation. The implications crashed down on her like a rock slide. Tom was not a skeptical lawman. He was part of the operation. The arrest was not a mistake, it was by design. Bruno wanted Kami silenced, and Tom was his instrument. She looked at Lillian, who was shaking so hard she could barely stand the twins whimpering in their wrappings. Theodore met her eyes, and in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them without words. "If Tom is involved," Alice said slowly, "then going through official channels means nothing. He will bury the evidence. He will silence the witnesses." "Or worse," Theodore said. "Those children will be on the train by morning, and no one will ever see them again." Alice felt something harden in her chest, a core of steel she had not known she possessed. "Then we do not go through official channels. We get them out ourselves. Tonight," Theodore nodded. "What do you need?" "Horses, supplies, a distraction." She looked at Lillian. "And courage." Night fell over Ghost Creek like a heavy velvet curtain. The town settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the sounds drifting from the saloon. Raucous laughter, the tinny notes of an out-of-tune piano, the occasional crash of breaking glass. In the sheriff's office, Trusty Tom sat at his desk, with a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow. The label read, "Old Rattlesnake," and promised smooth drinking, but Tom's grimace with each sip suggested otherwise. His head nodded forward, jerked back, nodded forward again. But Alice, watching from across the street, noticed that his hand never strayed far from his gun, and his eyes opened a crack every few minutes to scan the street. He was not as drunk as he appeared. Strong Steve lounged in a chair outside the jail's front entrance hat, tipped low over his eyes rifle across his lap. To a casual observer, he looked half asleep, but his fingers never strayed far from the trigger. Poison Pete was inside the saloon playing cards with a table of minors and losing slowly enough not to arouse suspicion. But his attention was divided. Every few minutes his gaze flicked toward the window that overlooked the jail. In the cell block, Keme sat on a narrow cot with his back against the stone wall, iron shackles chaining his wrists to a ring, bolted to the floor. His head throbbed where Tom had struck him. Blood had dried in his hair, making it stiff and matted. His shoulder ached with a deep grinding pain that suggested torn muscle. But his mind was clear. He had been in worse situations. Once during his time scouting for the Army, he had been captured by Confederate raiders and held for 3 days before escaping. He had learned patience then, and the value of waiting for the right moment, of watching and listening and preparing. The question was whether the right moment would come before they put him on a train heading east, or before someone decided a dead Apache was less trouble than a live one. Footsteps approached from the outer office, light, careful steps that did not match Tom's heavy tread. A woman's voice, pitched low and pleasant. "Sheriff Alden, I hope I am not disturbing you." Tom's chair scraped against the floor. "Miss Maud, what in blazes are you doing here at this hour?" "Dr. Finch sent me. He says the prisoner's arm needs cleaning and binding, or infection will set in. He would have come himself, but he is attending to the infants." A pause. "And the children asked to see him. The girl especially. She will not sleep. She keeps asking whether he is safe." A longer pause. Tom's voice, thick with whiskey but still suspicious, came reluctantly. "All right, but make it quick. And do not get close to the bars. He is dangerous." "Of course, Sheriff. Thank you." The outer door opened, then closed. Alice stepped into the cell block carrying a covered basket, her face carefully neutral. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the back entrance, Lillian waited with one twin cradled against her chest. Alice approached the cell slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. Keme watched her with dark, unreadable eyes. "Dr. Finch says your arm is injured," Alice said, pitching her voice to carry back to Tom's office. "I have clean bandages and carbolic solution." She set the basket on the floor and knelt unpacking its contents. Bandages, a bottle of antiseptic, a small loaf of bread, and a canteen of water. And beneath it all, carefully hidden, a single iron key. Their eyes met through the bars. Alice's hands shook as she glanced toward the key ring hanging on a nail beside Tom's desk, clearly visible through the doorway. She had planned this moment, rehearsed it in her mind, but now that it was happening, her courage threatened to fail. What if Tom woke? What if Strong Steve heard? What if they were all caught and hanged for aiding a fugitive? But then she looked at Keme's battered face, at the blood dried in his hair, at the raw skin where the shackles had bitten into his wrists. She thought of Theodore's words, "Tom is part of it." She thought of Lillian's voice, "Would you keep one of them?" And the choice no child should have to make. She reached for the key. Her fingers trembled so badly that the metal jingled. She froze, heart hammering against her ribs, and glanced toward the outer office. Tom did not stir. His snoring continued, but Alice noticed his breathing was too regular, too controlled. He was pretending. They had only seconds. Alice pulled the key free and passed it through the bars. Her shaking knuckles brushed Keem's steady, calloused hand. The contact lasted only a heartbeat, skin against skin, warm and alive, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. She snatched her hand back and mouthed one word, "Run." Keme nodded once. He waited until she had stepped back and then unlocked the shackles as quickly as he dared, easing them off his wrists without letting the metal clink against the bars. The iron had left deep red marks in his skin. Outside, a dog barked once sharp and sudden. Strong Steve's chair creaked. Boots scraped against wood. Alice walked calmly toward the front entrance basket on her arm, her heart threatening to burst through her ribs. She nodded to Strong Steve as she passed. "Good evening, Mr. Barlow." Steve grunted in response, his eyes tracking her as she crossed the street toward the clinic. The moment she was out of sight, Keem slipped out the back entrance of the jail, moving like smoke made solid. Lillian pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, as he materialized beside her. He took the twin from her arms, without a word, and motioned for her to follow. Behind them, inside the office, Tom's eyes snapped open. He had been listening for the telltale sound of the cell door, and he had heard nothing. Which meant the Apache was either still locked up, or Tom surged to his feet and ran to the cell block. Empty. "Steve," he bellowed. "The Apache is gone. Sound the alarm." But by then, Kemi, Alice, and Lillian were already at the livery stable mounting horses Theodore had prepared. They burst out the back gate just as Poison Pete staggered from the saloon gun in hand. He fired wild, the shot going wide in the darkness. A second shot followed closer, the bullet hissing past Alice's ear and splintering the fence post beside her. But darkness and speed were their allies. They galloped hard into the night, following the creek bed west away from the lights of town. Behind them, men scrambled to saddle horses. Tom's voice rose above the confusion, barking orders. Within minutes, an organized pursuit thundered after them, but the fugitives had precious minutes of lead time, and Kemi knew the country. He led them into broken terrain, where pursuit would be treacherous in darkness. They rode through the night until Ghost Creek was nothing but a faint glow on the horizon. By midday of the next day, the fugitives had reached the broken country west of Ghost Creek. The landscape shifted from open grassland to jagged red stone, scattered piñon pines, and ravines that dropped away into shadow. The abandoned Blue Rock mine sat at the base of a low mesa, its entrance a gaping black mouth in the hillside. Old timbers framed the opening, weathered and cracked. Rusted ore carts lay on their sides, wheels frozen with rust. A broken water sluice tilted at a drunken angle. The place stank of abandonment and something darker, a smell Keem recognized from battlefields and places where terrible things had happened. Old fear soaked into the earth. He dismounted and studied the ground. Boot prints led into the mine, layered over each other, some fresh, some days old. Someone had been coming here regularly. "Stay with the horses," he told Alice. "If I am not back in 10 minutes, ride for Blue Mountain Fort. Do not wait." "I am coming with you," Alice said flatly. "You cannot—" "I can read, Mr. Keme. You cannot. If those ledgers are in there, you will need me to understand what they say. And if we are caught, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He wanted to argue, but she was right. He nodded once, checked the load in his rifle, and led the way inside. The air in the mine was cool and oppressive, thick with the smell of damp stone and something organic that made Alice's stomach turn. She carried a lantern, the flame casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and reach across the walls. They moved carefully, testing each step. The overhead timbers groaned with every shift of weight, shedding dust and small pebbles that rattled down like warnings. The main tunnel branched into 3 smaller passages. Keme followed the freshest boot prints, leading them deeper into the earth. 50 yards in, Alice stopped abruptly. "Keme, look." She raised the lantern toward the wall. Scratched into the soft stone were crude drawings, stick figures, houses the sun. A child's drawing. Beside it, letters scraped with a nail or a rock. Help. Cold. Mama. Alice's throat closed. Sweet heaven, they kept children down here. They moved forward, the horror growing with each step. Another drawing. A broken wooden doll lying in a puddle of stagnant water, its painted face worn away to blank wood. A length of chain bolted to the wall, the link small enough for a child's ankle, the metal worn smooth where it had rubbed against skin. Lillian, who had followed despite being told to stay outside, pressed close to Alice and whispered, "How long? How long were they here?" "Too long," Alice said, her voice breaking. At the end of the passage, they found the chamber. Wooden crates were stacked against the far wall, stamped with Ghost Creek station seals in black ink. Keme approached cautiously, rifle ready, and kicked the nearest crate open. Inside, beneath oily rags, lay a heap of iron restraints. Small shackles, collars with short chains, manacles sized for children's wrists. Each piece was marked with a number scratched into the metal inventory control. Alice set the lantern on a crate and lifted one of the collars with shaking hands. It was so small, it would fit a child barely older than the twins. The iron had worn smooth in places where skin had rubbed against it repeatedly. She thought of the child who had worn this, wondered if they were still alive, and felt bile rise in her throat. Keme moved to the next crate. This one held ledgers, thick books, bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with tight rows of handwriting. He pulled one out and handed it to Alice. She opened it and began to read, her face growing paler with each line. The ledgers were meticulous. Each entry recorded a child's name, age, physical description, point of origin, date of receipt, destination, and price paid. Some destinations she recognized from newspaper articles. Mines in Colorado, textile mills in Pennsylvania, ranches in Texas. Others were unfamiliar, just names scrawled in hasty shorthand. Sandstone Bluff Mine. She read aloud, her voice hollow. 23 children delivered over 2 years, ages 5 to 14. Spanish Wells Smelter, 16 children. Broken Arrow Ranch, 9 children, all under age 10. The operation stretched across territories, moving children like cargo through a network of stations and agents. And the railroad provided everything: infrastructure, legitimacy, speed. Lillian pressed a dirty finger to one line, her hand trembling. Hannah. She was 12. I met her on the train last summer. She told me her parents died of cholera and she was going to live with an aunt in Kansas. Alice found the entry. Hannah Morrison, age 12, brown hair, brown eyes, height 4 feet 11 inches. Received Ghost Creek Station, June 10, 1866. Delivered Sandstone Bluff Mine, June 15, 1866. Payment, 40. She was never adopted, Alice whispered. She was sold to a mine. Keme's jaw locked, muscles bunching beneath his skin. The crime before them was not opportunistic. It was industrial, systematic. Children were raw material processed through Ghost Creek like ore through a smelter. A sound echoed from the entrance, hoofbeats rattling down the shaft. Then voices distorted by the tunnel but unmistakable. Tracks lead straight in, fresh ones. They are here. Bruno Keller's voice, then we go in after them. I want those ledgers, and I want witnesses eliminated. All of them. No more mistakes. Tom's voice. What about Steve and Pete? Pete is already circling around to the back vent. Steve is watching the horses. We seal them in and finish this. Rocks dislodged from the ceiling, clattering down the passage. A timber groaned. Then one of the twins, startled by the noise, and the darkness let out a piercing wail that echoed through the chamber like a bell. There! Bruno's shout. Move! Keme grabbed the nearest ledger, shoved it under his shirt, and pointed to a narrow ventilation shaft at the back of the chamber. That way. Now. They crawled through the shaft one by one, dragging the babies ahead. The passage was barely wide enough for an adult, the walls rough and jagged, scraping skin and catching on clothing. Halfway through, a rotten timber gave way beneath Alice's weight with a crack like thunder. She dropped waist-deep into a hidden pit pane, exploding through her thigh as it scraped against jagged rock embedded in the shaft floor. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, trying not to scream. Keme dropped to his belly instantly and reached for her. "Grab my arm." "I cannot, my leg, it is caught." He wedged his shoulder against the remaining support timber, every muscle straining. The wood groaned, splintering. He hooked his good arm around her waist and heaved with everything he had. For one breathless second, they were chest to chest, her hands gripping his shoulders, his heartbeat thudding hard against hers, their faces inches apart in the dim lantern light. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the solid strength that had carried them this far, the rapid pulse at his throat that matched her own. Then he shoved upward the strain, wrenching his already injured shoulder so badly that white-hot agony shot down his entire arm. His vision grayed. But Alice came free. "Go!" He gritted through clenched teeth. "Do not stop." They scrambled out onto the far side of the hill, just as gunshots began to tear through the tunnel they had abandoned. Bullets ricocheted off stone, whining and shrieking like tortured spirits. The crates and most of the ledgers remained inside, but they had one book, one piece of evidence that could not be explained away. And now everyone knew they had it. The escape route funneled them into a box canyon, where a shallow river snaked between steep sandstone walls. The water was barely deep enough to cover the horses' hooves, but it was moving, which meant there was a source somewhere upstream. The horses were lathered and trembling, their breath coming in harsh gasps. Alice's leg throbbed where the rocks had gouged deep blood, soaking through her dress. The twins were wailing with hunger and exhaustion, their faces red and scrunched. They reached a cluster of boulders near the water and slid from the saddle's legs, barely holding them upright. Ahead, the canyon narrowed to a slot barely wide enough for one horse at a time. Behind them, the sound of pursuit drew steadily closer, hoofbeats echoing off stone like drumbeats of doom. Keme studied the walls, too sheer to climb while carrying children, too unstable to trust. The rock face was striated with layers, some hard sandstone, some soft shale, all crumbling at the slightest pressure. If they tried to run through the slot, the hunters would shoot them like fish in a barrel from the high ground. He loaded his Winchester, one-handed, the motion awkward and agonizing with his damaged shoulder, and stepped into the open sand. "Hide behind the rocks," he told Alice. "Take the children into the reeds. If I fall, wait until full dark, then follow the river upstream. Stay in the water. They cannot track wet stone. Head northwest to the fort at Blue Mountain." Alice wanted to argue, but the logic was undeniable. With her injured leg, she would only slow him down, and someone needed to survive to tell the story. She dragged Lillian and the twins into the shelter of cattails and boulders, biting her lip against the searing pain in her thigh. Bruno, Tom, and strong Steve rode into view, their horses high-stepping through the shallow water. Steve's face was set and hard, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. Bruno pointed toward the cluster of boulders. "There. Take the girl and the brats. I want the Apache alive long enough to watch us burn that ledger. Then hang him from the canyon rim as a warning." Shots cracked across the canyon. Keme returned fire, his aim hampered by the grinding pain in his shoulder. He managed to nick Tom's hat, sending it spinning into the water. But the return fire was relentless. Bullets chipped stone around him. One grazed his ribs, tearing through his shirt and drawing a line of fire across his skin. He spun sideways and dropped behind a boulder, breathing hard blood soaking through the fabric. From her hiding place, Lillian watched the hunters spreading out to flank Keme. Her breath came in tiny, hitching gasps. She remembered the wagon, the horses bolting. The hunters' spare mounts were tethered downstream, half hidden among willows. Lillian looked at Alice, who nodded understanding, despite her fear. "Be careful," Alice whispered. Lillian belly-crawled through the reeds' cold water, soaking her dress mud, caking her arms. Her heart hammered so hard, she thought it would burst. She reached the horses, grabbed a dropped canteen, and slapped the nearest animal's rump as hard as she could while screaming at the top of her lungs. The spooked horses reared and bolted. One crashed into Steve's mount, tangling reins. Another plowed through Bruno's line of fire just as he squeezed the trigger, and the bullet ricocheted harmlessly. In the chaos, Poison Pete, who had been circling through the rocks, clubbed Keme from behind with his revolver butt. Keme collapsed, vision swimming. He tried to rise, but his limbs would not obey. Rough hands grabbed him, wrenching his arms behind his back. When the dust cleared, he was bound and lashed over the back of a horse. Bruno, face twisted with fury, grabbed one of the twins from where Alice crouched, frozen. He held the infant carelessly by its swaddling. "We take the Apache and one brat," he snarled. "Insurance. You follow us or try anything, I drop this one in the river. When we are done with him, we will come back for the rest of you. And then nobody talks. Ever." Alice clutched the remaining twin, and Lillian watching helplessly as Keme was carried away toward Ghost Creek. Toward the train. Night draped Ghost Creek in layers of wood smoke and lamplight. The orphan train sat beside the river bridge, steam curling from its stack like restless spirits. At the far end of the rail yard, away from the station platform, Bruno supervised as men loaded a special freight car. Inside, chained to iron rings, huddled a group of children. They ranged from perhaps 5 to 14 years old, hollow-eyed, silent. Among them was the twin taken from Keme. Keme, battered and shackled, was marched toward the same car. His plan was clear: send Keme east as cargo to the mines along with the children. He would disappear. No witnesses, no scandal. Across the river, hidden in willow thickets, Alice and Lillian crouched with the remaining twin. Farmer Obadiah sat with them, his old Spencer rifle ready. "When I fire," he said quietly, "you run for that freight car. Get it open. I will keep them busy." Alice nodded, her throat too tight for words. They climbed the coal chute ladder, moving one careful rung at a time. From the top, they could see into the freight car through ventilation slats, small wrists and chains, tear-streaked faces, the stolen twin. Strong Steve stood guard near the car. But something had changed in him. His jaw was tight, his stance rigid. He kept looking at the chained children, then away, then back. Lillian descended until she was just above him. She pulled out the transcribed ledger page Alice had copied and dropped it. It fluttered down and landed at his feet. Steve looked up, saw Lillian, and his hand went to his gun. Then he saw the terror in her eyes and hesitated. "Read it," she whispered. "Please. You've been helping them. You've been delivering us." Steve picked up the paper. His frown deepened as he read. Then his face went white. One name jumped out at him: Sandstone Bluff Mine. He had been there, 6 months ago, delivering what he thought were court-assigned orphans to legitimate placements. He had seen children working in conditions that made his stomach turn. Small bodies hauling ore, faces gray with exhaustion. A foreman who had laughed when Steve asked about schooling. He had told himself it was not his business. The paperwork was in order. The railroad vouched for everything. But this ledger showed payment dates that matched his delivery receipts exactly. He had not been transporting orphans to families. He had been delivering slaves to mines. His hands began to shake. "What have I done?" he whispered. Then louder to Bruno, "What in blazes is this?" He strode forward, brandishing the paper. "You told me these were legal placements, court orders." Bruno's hand moved toward his pistol. You are paid to haul Barlow, not to think. Give me that paper. No. Steve's voice was iron. No more. These are children. I have been... Obadiah's rifle cracked from across the river. The shot echoed like thunder. Men dove for cover. Children screamed. The rail yard erupted into chaos. Alice ran along the train, yanking at door latches. When it opens, run to the schoolhouse. Inside the car, Kame shoulder-checked his guard, driving them both into cargo crates. The impact jarred his dislocated shoulder back into place with a sickening crunch and a supernova of pain. But the joint worked again. He used the slack chain to trip another guard, then hurled himself sideways to dodge a bullet. Strong Steve, now fully committed, covered Alice with his rifle. Go get them out. The freight car door slid open. Children spilled out, falling, running, crying. Townsfolk emerged from buildings, confused, horrified, finally seeing the truth. Bruno realized everything was collapsing. He grabbed the chain twin and bolted for the wooden trestle leading to the river bridge. Keme, half-blind with pain, saw Bruno running with the baby. He forced his battered body into motion and gave chase. The trestle was narrow, the planks old and rain-slicked. Thunder rumbled overhead. Lightning flickered. Bruno reached the center of the bridge and turned, holding the baby out over the edge. 20 feet below the river, rushed black and cold. Stop or I drop him, Bruno shouted. Keme drew the revolver he had taken from the guard but did not raise it. One shot in darkness on wet boards with a hostage impossible. He holstered the gun and moved forward carefully, using the rope railing for balance. You are finished, Bruno. Let the child go. Finished. Bruno laughed, ugly and bitter. The railroad owns judges, politicians, half the army. I walk, you hang. He shifted his weight, preparing to throw. The plank beneath him cracked. His boot plunged through. He stumbled. The baby slipped from his grasp. Keme lunged, boots planted wide, one hand grabbing the rope rail, the other snatching empty air. His fingers closed on the edge of the blanket. The weight jerked him forward, slamming his chest against the rail. His shoulder screamed, but he held on. He dragged the infant up, cradling it against his chest. Bruno, boot still caught, clawed at the railing. Help me. A voice called from the far end of the bridge. Need a hand, Apache, poison. Pete stepped into view, knife gleaming. He had circled around while everyone was distracted, and now he blocked the only escape route. Keme was trapped. Bruno behind him, Pete ahead, a baby in his arms, standing on a bridge that was falling apart. Nowhere to run, Pete hissed, advancing slowly, knife held low for a gutting strike. Thunder crashed. Rain began to fall in sheets, turning the planks into ice. Keme backed up, putting distance between himself and Pete, but that brought him closer to Bruno, who was frantically trying to free his trapped boot. Pete lunged. Keme twisted, using the railing as a pivot point, and Pete's knife scraped his ribs instead of plunging into his gut. Keme kicked out, catching Pete's knee. The bounty hunter stumbled, but did not fall. Behind Keme, Bruno finally wrenched his boot free and grabbed for Keme's ankle, trying to trip him. Keme was fighting on two fronts now, one arm cradling the screaming baby, the other hand empty, his body positioned between two killers on a bridge barely wide enough for one. Pete came again, knife flashing. Keme blocked with his forearm, the blade slicing a shallow cut, and drove his elbow into Pete's face. Bone crunched, blood sprayed, but the blow cost him his balance. He staggered sideways toward the edge. Bruno lunged from behind, wrapping both arms around Keme's legs, trying to topple him over the rail. The baby slipped. Keme grabbed it with both hands, which meant he had no hands to defend himself or catch his balance. For one impossible moment, he was falling. Then Strong Steve's voice roared from the near end of the bridge. Pete! Pete turned distracted for a fraction of a second. Keme drove his boot heel down onto Bruno's wrist. Bones cracked. Bruno screamed and let go. Keme surged forward, lowering his shoulder like a battering ram, and slammed into Poison Pete with all his remaining strength. Pete went over the rail, backward knife spinning from his hand, his scream cutting off abruptly when he hit the water. Keme stumbled to his knees, gasping, the baby still clutched to his chest. Behind him, Bruno tried to stand, but the broken planks gave way completely. He fell through the gap, fingers scrabbling at wet wood, finding no purchase. He plunged into the river with a heavy splash and did not resurface. Keme knelt on the swaying bridge rain, pouring down, the baby wailing in his arms. Lightning lit the canyon in stark flashes. Strong Steve ran across the bridge and grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet. "Come on, before the whole thing comes down." They stumbled back to solid ground as the central span groaned and sagged, timbers cracking like gunshots. The rail yard was chaos. Soldiers were arriving from the fort. Children huddled under blankets. Bruno was gone. Pete was gone. Tom had vanished into the night rather than face arrest. The trafficking ring's hub had been shattered. Morning light found Ghost Creek transformed. Soldiers from Fort Blue Mountain had taken control. An army captain set up headquarters in the town hall, taking statements, examining evidence. Children from the freight car slept in the schoolhouse under Alice's watch. Theodore tended injuries. Obadiah stood guard with his rifle, daring anyone to try taking those children again. Keme sat in the clinic while Theodore reset his shoulder properly, stitched his ribs, and bandaged a dozen other wounds. "You should be dead," Theodore said bluntly. "I know." Lillian refused to leave his side, one twin in her lap, the other in a basket beside her. Strong Steve appeared in the doorway, his face haggard. He had spent the night giving testimony, holding nothing back. "They are issuing warrants," he said. "Mine owners, ranch bosses, station agents in 3 territories, everyone in Bruno's network." "And you?" Alice asked. "I cooperate fully. I testify. Maybe that earns me leniency. Maybe I hang alongside them." Steve's voice was raw. "But I will not walk away from what I did." He looked at Kim. "You saved those children. You could have let them die. You could have run. You did not. That counts for something." Keme nodded slowly. "You chose right when it mattered." Days passed. The investigation expanded. Railroad officials tried to contain it, but the evidence ledger's chains, living witnesses, was too overwhelming. Weeks later, the army captain called Alice and Kim to the town hall. "We have a problem," he said. "Legal placement for these children. Lillian has guardianship of the twins by her sister's will, but she is 8 years old." "What are you suggesting?" Alice asked. "Joint guardianship. You, Miss Maud, are a schoolteacher of good reputation. You, Mr. Keme, are an Army scout with an exemplary service record. Together, you constitute a stable household." He slid papers across the desk. "The railroad will deed land to you as restitution. You keep the children safe. You report to the fort monthly. You stay in the territory until trials conclude." It was not romantic. It was not even kind. It was pragmatic. But it was a chance. "What do you say?" Alice looked at Kemi. He looked back. "Yes," Alice said. "Yes." Kemi agreed. Lillian, standing between them, smiled for the first time since the wagon burned. 6 months passed. The deeded land sat on the high prairie where the wagon had been attacked. Kemi and Obadiah built a cabin, small but solid, with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. Alice turned the main room into a schoolhouse, teaching Lillian and other children from nearby homesteads. The twins toddled between desks, laughing. Keme worked the land slowly, his shoulder healing but never quite the same. Lillian helped without being asked, learning, growing stronger. One autumn afternoon, Strong Steve rode up wearing a deputy marshal's badge. 18 arrests so far, he reported. 5 depots shut down, more indictments coming. Most of the children are being reunited with families or placed in real orphanages with oversight. It was not perfect justice, but it was something. After Steve left, Alice found Kemi at the property edge watching the sunset. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Stopping that day?" "No," Kemi said. "That was the one choice I do not regret." Alice stepped closer. "I am glad you did. I did not choose." The moment she asked the question, there was only one answer. All of them. All of them. 2 years later, on a clear spring morning, a small group gathered outside the cabin. Theodore was there, and Obadiah, and Strong Steve with his marshal's badge. Neighbors, the army captain who had overseen the investigation. Alice wore blue calico. Keme wore a clean shirt with new feathers braided into his hair. Obadiah, serving as justice of the peace, read the brief ceremony. "Do you, Alice Maud, take this man as your lawful husband?" "I do." "Do you, Keme, take this woman as your lawful wife?" "I do." "Then I pronounce you married." No kiss that was not the Apache way, and Alice respected it. Instead, Keme took her hand, a simple gesture that meant everything. That evening, after guests left and children slept, Alice and Keme sat on the porch watching stars emerge. "Do you think we did right?" Alice asked. "I think we did what was needed. I do not regret it." "Neither do I." Inside, one twin began to cry. Keme rose. "I will go." Alice watched him disappear inside this man, who had stopped when every instinct told him to ride away, who had chosen to keep them all. The prairie wind carried the smell of sage and distant rain. A coyote sang, and another answered. Alice looked up at the stars. The work was not finished. It might never be finished. But here, 3 children who should have died were learning to read and laugh and hope. That was enough to build on. Inside, Keme sang softly in Apache while rocking the twin. Lillian woke and leaned against his shoulder. "Are we safe now?" she asked. "Safe enough, and together. That is what matters." "Good. I am glad you kept us, all of us." Keme smiled. "So am I, little one." He carried Lillian to bed, returned to the porch where Alice waited. "They are settled." "Thank you." They stood in comfortable silence. Tomorrow would bring work. There was always work. But this moment was enough. The question that had started everything, would you keep one of them, no longer haunted anyone's dreams. The answer had been written in ink and deed and law, in the life they had built from ash and blood and determination. All of them. Always all of them. That simple, stubborn truth was worth every mile, every battle, every choice. The stars wheeled overhead. The prairie stretched endless. The cabin's windows glowed warm. Home.